we know that it's time.
Yeah. Do you want to cue?
We'll give everybody about 30 seconds to join us. All right, well, we'll get started now. Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of the 7th annual Global Homeboy Network Gathering, virtual style. My name is Steve Delgado, and I'm the Chief Development Officer at Homeboy Industries. I recently celebrated my 1-year anniversary at Homeboy, and I wanted to take just a moment to thank all of the amazing women and men at Homeboy for sharing so much with me. As Father Greg says, you don't go to the margins to make a difference, but you go so that the widow, orphan, and stranger make you different. Well, Greg and my Homeboy family, if you're watching, know that I'm different today and have received far more from you than I can ever give. Those of you who were able to attend yesterday's amazing sessions understand why I feel the way I do, as you were able to hear about the stories and impact of Homeboy Industries. And I hope also take away pieces of our practice rooted in kinship and tenderness that might apply to your organization. And if you missed yesterday's sessions, don't worry, because as registered participants of this year's conference, you'll have access to all of our sessions on a recorded basis, including this one. And this morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world, we're really lucky to have 3 distinguished panelists to join us for our conversation. As we all know, now more than ever, we rely on the generous funding, partnerships, and thought leadership of the foundation community to support our missions and daily work. And as these unprecedented times have caused us all to experience or create the pandemic pivot in our own organizations, our funding partners have had to navigate these tumultuous times as well, facing new pressures and challenges from many directions. So during the next 90 minutes or so, I'm thrilled that these talented individuals will share insights with us on how this incredible time is impacting the foundation community and how grantees can best navigate foundation relationships during this time as well. I'm thrilled to introduce Wendy Guerin, President and CEO of the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation. The Parsons Foundation is focused on improving the lives of Angelenos through responsive investments focused on civic and cultural, education, health, and human service needs, emphasizing support for low-income children and families. Wendy brings vision to this vital organization as CEO, and also a tireless spirit of making a difference in my hometown. I'm a great admirer of Wendy, so thank you for being here with us, Wendy, and I'm hoping you might just be able to share a little bit more about Parsons, your work, and a question that I hope we can all get started with this morning, which is, what's firing you up right now about your work at Parsons and making a difference?
Well, I want to leap to what's firing me up, but let me hold the horses and give a little context for the foundation. We're focused on the lives of Angelenos. So Los Angeles County is where we make our investments. That's changed over the years. We used to have a bigger footprint. It's a funny thing, the change of a conservative organization. I think of us as conservative, and that we have change happens, but it occurs over time. So we're not the kind of an organization that has a new day tomorrow, or we find, we're a new approach. It's all very incremental in terms of our focus. So the lives of Angelenos in 4 big pockets: education, human services, healthcare, and civic and cultural grant making. So it makes us almost in a way more like a community foundation, close to the community. Site visits are a really important part of the grant making. And it's about a $20 million distribution currently in LA. That makes us a slightly bigger fish in this pond because we're not a big foundation. And what's firing me up, I think, is maybe a handoff to Tanya, because I think the systems change work we're having a once in a lifetime opportunity. The disruption that we're facing in services is allowing people to think differently in concrete ways about access, about how to, about impact. And I think that if we have courage to proceed, I think we can make changes that could really matter to the populations we care about. So I think there's a lot of, it's like never let a crisis go to waste. Well, this is a once in 100-year crisis, and I think it gives us fantastic opportunity to make a difference.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Wendy. And we'll get back to many of the themes that you just mentioned, which are so important. You mentioned Tanya, and I'm really pleased to welcome Tanya Washington from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, all the way from Baltimore, Maryland this morning. So thanks for taking your lunch hour, Tanya, to join us. Tanya is a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, currently working in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group. Tanya is a thought leader at the foundation, spearheading their strategy to end the youth prison model through a host of tactics, really in pursuit of a new paradigm on the front of juvenile justice. Tanya, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and I'll turn it over to you to share a little bit more about your amazing work and thought leadership on that front. More about Annie E. Casey, and also more about, as we discussed earlier, it sounds like there's lots of things that are firing you up right now.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Wendy, for your comments, and also to our other panelist, Stephanie. So I want to give a little background on the Annie E. Casey Foundation for people who might not be as familiar with our mission and where we started. So the Annie E. Casey Foundation was founded by Jim Casey. He also and his siblings also founded Casey Family Program. So sometimes folks confuse Annie E., which is the foundation named after his mother. And the Casey family is actually the family that founded UPS, the United Parcel Service. When Jim Casey and his siblings were growing up on the West Coast in Washington State, their father passed away, and they began delivering packages to bring some extra income into the home. And over time, that and their ambition grew into them starting their own business, which is UPS. And what they learned is trying to make UPS be the strongest company that they could be, is that some of the employees that were struggling had come from hardship, from systems, child welfare systems, and times of hardship and trauma. And so they wanted to find ways to support those employees and to learn from what they were hearing. And as a result, when they made profits, they formed foundations, and this one, Annie E., is named after his mother. So our entire foundation is steeped in a belief that communities are responsible for helping families become healthy, and that systems should not only do no harm, but should figure out how to perhaps offer support, and they can't do that the best way without partnering, both with communities and families. And so that's a real blessing for us at Annie E, and it's a blessing in this moment in time because that's our natural inclination anyway.
Mm.
I happen to sit in the Center for System Innovation, focusing on juvenile justice reform. And I'm really trying to focus in this moment on what are the better ways to respond to youth and young adults who are struggling, and particularly those who might have become engaged in very harmful offending, violent offending, sometimes gang involvement. And I learned of Homeboy's Industries years ago, and I am so blessed to be able to partner with you all and learn from you all. I mean, I am very much changed in terms of how I use the resources that I have available to me in terms of figuring out how to best serve youth and young adults who are coming through the juvenile justice system. So I'm fired up in this moment about the enhanced focus on the importance of strengthening communities, because that's where the action is, that's where the resources should be, and that really is what keeps me up at night in a good way, trying to figure out how to partner differently, support differently, and enhance the work that and the strategies that I'm trying to promote in my role at Casey.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Tanya. And while you mentioned partners, if you can just spend a few seconds, and maybe Wendy, we didn't quite get to this, but in terms of taking on new partners and new funding relationships, if you can just quickly describe how the foundation generally approaches that.
Thank you, Steve. Yes. So Annie E, most of us know Annie E as a funder, as a grant-making organization, but we don't have sort of open calls for creative work. Typically what we do is we have work that's focused in communities, on system reform, on strengthening economic success. And based on the strategies that we're promoting, we're usually meeting individuals and then starting conversations about how we can better promote the strategies. So during this time of COVID and George Floyd and the enhanced awareness of equity, the need for racial equity, we're obviously not out at conferences in person. We're doing more virtual connections, but through the relationships that we do have, we are meeting other individuals as we try to determine ways to strengthen our portfolios of work. So you can go to the aecf.org website and learn more about everything that we're working on, but you won't find a button that says apply for funds here. But the more you can learn what we're doing, participate on some of the online things that we're having, there may be natural conversations that come up that might foster opportunities for partnering and engaging moving forward.
That's great. Thank you, Tanya. And Wendy, circling back to you very quickly, I know you mentioned obviously your Los Angeles focus, but in terms of process for those folks who are interested in just hearing about new partnerships, can you just weigh in for a second on that?
Happy to. I'll do it from the point of view of both Parsons and the field. There's a saying that people like to use about philanthropy, and it's, you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And, you know, there's something like in Alaska, there's lots of words for snow. But, you know, ultimately each flake is a little different, but it's still snow. So Tanya is the kind of snow that there is no button to apply. But we're the kind of foundation, yep, we're a responsive grant maker. We have an embedded LOI in our website. Anybody can apply. And we've, you know, our values are such that we're not changing our procedures during COVID. In other words, new organizations can walk through that portal every day. But that said, I think it's a higher barrier now. We're very constrained financially, although our board is in an overspend mode. We have done some extraordinary relief grant making, and if we did that grant making on top, I wanted to do it on top of our regular grant making, because otherwise it's a zero-sum game. So we increased our payout by 10% this year. This may be a little inside baseball, but I'm expecting we'll be close to 7% next year just on maintenance of effort. One of my board members said about perpetuity, we'd like the foundation to be around forever, but we'd like Los Angeles to make it too. And so that tension of resources, I think, is very pronounced. And to start a new relationship now with a new grantee, I think there's like speed bumps in the way. And I want to acknowledge those. That said, we will, continue to find new organizations to fund, but we want to stand beside those that we really know. We have worries that this is an extinction moment. We want to make sure that organizations that to us, it's subjective, are cornerstones in the community, in their trust with the community. We want to make sure they're still standing on the other side of this.
Thank you for that. Staying in Los Angeles for a second, at least geographically, just down the street from Wendy, we're so pleased to be able to welcome Stephanie Lomibao, Senior Vice President and a member of the Environmental, Social, and Governance team, serving as a program manager for the Bank of America Charitable Foundation. As part of that program, Stephanie helps deliver the bank's philanthropic initiatives and programs, including volunteerism and thought leadership. And Stephanie has a big job with lots of accountability, but I know that never gets in her way of using her talents, insights, and genuine desire to make an impact in connecting with the grantee community. So thank you, Stephanie, for being with us today. And if you can cover a few of the things that both Wendy and Tanya have covered, including the very important firing up question to get us started. Well, I think you might be on mute. Are you on mute?
Can you hear me now? Great. Let me first and foremost start by saying thank you to you, Steve, Father G, Tom, and the entire Homeboy team for continuing the legacy of the Global Homeboy Network, even in this new virtual environment, and all that you do to inspire funders like myself to continue this fight and this work to really serve those that might be forgotten. And thank you for that kind introduction. I love what Tanya and Wendy were saying around partnership and courage, access and impact. For Bank of America and our foundation, we know that our funding priorities around economic mobility and economic resiliency hold true now more than ever. But there's this tremendous need and urgency to really be deliberate and intentional around racial and economic inequalities that have been exposed by COVID. So the way our foundation works is we actually have funding in 91 communities across the United States. So we are a local and responsive funder. We also fund in 3 regions outside of the United States: Asia Pacific, Latin America, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We give about $250 million annually, but most recently, thanks to the championship and sponsorship of our CEO, we've made a commitment of $1 billion over 4 years to really be intentional about how we're addressing race and economic inequalities through our grant making. And so we have 4 verticals. These have been verticals that we funded historically around economic mobility. But again, I think the difference is how are we specifically investing in communities of color, in Black and Brown communities that have been disparately and historically marginalized and impacted, and they're the ones that face the most extraordinary barriers to access. And so we fund small business and affordable housing, workforce with a focus on upskilling and reskilling to high demand industries and jobs, and social determinants of health. And so my role has been historically focused on communities that have been the most vulnerable. So I've worked with grantees at a global and a national level tied to social justice, second chance. And what fires me up is this awakened consciousness around civil rights and social justice. We've known as an organization and as a funder personally, the importance of funding at the margins because of what we learn, right? And because that will make the most tremendous difference in our communities that we live in and serve. But because of Black Lives Matter, because of what we've seen and felt and heard around the death of George Floyd, there is no longer an isolated movement. This is a movement that's interconnected, and that intersectionality of what we're going to do and take action on moving forward, not just as funders, but as community members, is going to be so critical. And so I'll just end with a quote from our CEO, because again, it is because of our CEO that we've taken the work that we've built up to date and magnified it to a 4-year, $1 billion commitment. And in his response to the public, he said, there's a true sense of urgency that's arisen, and we must not let it quiet down. So to have his leadership in this movement and in this opportunity is so exciting, and that's what fires me up.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And thank you all for sharing more about yourselves and your organizations and your inspiration right now. I know we're all seeking that as well, so it's great to hear those stories from you. And, during the next, let's call it 60 minutes or so that we have remaining together, I wanted to make sure that we could cover a number of things that you all referenced, but one of them being the context, ongoing discussion on context and climate. Obviously, we continue to be in a different context and climate than we have been in our lives ever. And it's so important for us as partners and as fundraisers to understand what that context and climate continues to be about, particularly as it impacts your wonderful organizations. And secondly, I want to make sure that we can take questions from our global audience today. So we'll maybe dart in and out of both of those themes with the remaining time. And again, thank you for all the insight that you'll share. But we'll start maybe with a question that has come in from our global community. And I think it does speak a little bit to context and climate as well. But the question relates to funding and how funding priorities, at least from this questioner, is perceived to be always sort of a top-down process, particularly even maybe within the foundation and institutional framework. So the question is, how are foundations right now, and what should we take away as a grant-making organization or organizations? How are foundations making sure that the priorities that they have are the priorities of those on the ground level communities in need? And how are your organizations sort of doing that, having those conversations, and how can we continue to participate more broadly speaking in those conversations with the foundation community? Wendy, you wanna jump in there?
Some of the audience may be aware that right at the beginning of the crisis, the Council on Foundations, which is a sort of connective tissue for philanthropy internationally, stepped up to suggest that we should, as a field, be more flexible with our grantees during this period. So I think one of the things that I'm proud about is last I looked, there were 700 organizations that had signed on to the pledge, which we did a number of things, which was waive reporting requirements, escalate payments. If payments were coming due, we pushed them out faster. Really being, that flexible partner, the non-demanding flexible partner during this time, I think is something that, became, I think, pronounced. And so that in addition to finding more money, and that requires our boards, really. Some of these, there's things you can do at the staff level, and then there's things that are really policy related. And so we also made some, very quick grants. We did an emergency docket, food bank, you know, childcare for first responders, that sort of thing. But I am more worried about recovery than I am in some ways about relief. I think, you know, this sort of the tension of immediate response is important, but we're also focused on the capacity building for the organizations. You know, nonprofits are fragile. The Nonprofit Finance Fund tells us that most nonprofits only had 6 weeks operating capital. And so this, the undercapitalization of nonprofits, you know, is a serious problem. And we're hoping that this moment is going to be one. The other thing I would share is we're a general operating, we provide unrestricted operating support to our grantees. We're a big believer that that's a way to build capacity. But we've also found that we need to do specific capacity building grants for our nonprofits, because if we just give people general op, they don't want to invest in training. You know, sometimes the money isn't there to do it all. And so you almost have to have like a sidecar grant. You know, IBM understands that, you know, and I bet Bank of America does too, that you need to invest in your team, that your human capital is the most important part of your organization. And I think the nonprofit world has been on the short end of the stick always in terms of really investing in our people, recognizing that, you know, our boards and our staff make the work possible. And so we're also going to be investing more in those sort of sidecar capacity investments to help keep our grantees on track.
That's great. Tanya, you have anything to add to that?
I would underscore everything that Wendy said about being more flexible and the capacity building. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, typically we do have pretty strict requirements around scope of work and performance measures. We've been able to be more flexible around those. We've been able to offer more general support grants and make reporting requirements a little more simplified. We have an online process for our grantees. I've also been able to, and I think my colleagues have as well, really have conversations with our existing grantees about how they might use this moment differently. Some of our grantees are membership organizations that are used to spending resources on in-person conferences. And so we've been able to have conversations about how to translate, just like HBI is doing, translate to more virtual platforms, resources to provide support for Zoom and the different types of online platforms. Also figuring out how they might just do different things, like issue briefs instead of a conference, a research in different areas. We still want to be results oriented and outcome based, but figuring out how to use this moment differently to accomplish the results that we all care about is how we've been able to kind of lean into this moment. And the other thing about listening and hearing from communities, we have some work groups going on right now to really try to figure out how we might hear differently from communities. I know one area on the system reform side that we're learning a lot more about and trying to be more flexible in is the area of restorative justice and restorative community conference. It's a huge need to strengthen communities' capacity for doing that in a way that will impact young people who are justice involved and perhaps keep them out of confinement. Another area that we're hearing, particularly from the young people, is they want to hear from individuals who have their shared experience. And so really investing individuals with lived experience and organizations that partner with or are led by or promote strategies that value the life experience that of individuals who've been justice involved, who can then hear differently and connect differently and be trusted differently from young people who are walking in those shoes to perhaps intervene sooner and help them figure out how to transform what they're doing and transform their lives for the better before they end up incarcerated for long periods of time. So those are the things that we've been hearing, but really open to continuing conversations and being involved in conversations that are happening so that we can learn how we might best support the needs that are out there.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, literally overnight, we went from working together in our offices to, the next day, we weren't sure when we were going to see each other again. Thankfully, of course, there's Zoom, and now we've been able to see more of each other than ever, of course. But part of what we did at Homeboy, back in the early days, late March, of Stay at Home, was immediately sort of circle the wagons and develop a strategy of outreach to our foundation partners, right? As so many other organizations were doing, as you all know. And Stephanie, what we were delighted about at Homeboy in many respects was how the foundation community was equally putting together their own strategies on their outreach to community, much like Tanya was referencing in terms of, how to attenuate in a stronger way to the needs of the grantee community. And I wonder if you can just share a little bit about how the bank is continuing and the foundation is continuing to attenuate to the needs of the grant-making community on that front. And you shared a little bit in your opening remarks, but feel free to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate the insight that Wendy and Tanya shared. I too heard from our grantees around the need for flexible, multi-year, unrestricted cooperating support. When it comes to responding to current events and how we're being nimble, it's so important to have that proximity of experience. One of our basic practices in our grant making is to have the voice of community be part of the assessment of whether or not our funding priorities make sense. But even more so, especially because of COVID, a lot of our grant making, in fact, the majority of our grant making has been made across the 91 local communities, because we know that proximity and listening and being intentional about hearing about what's happening takes place at the local level. And so as much as we have these strategic global and national partnerships, to be able to hear what our grantees are saying and to be able to get the monies out to local communities was a critical piece of how we were able to respond to the dual pandemics. I will also say, when it comes to working with grantees and nonprofits, many of you on the line, it's relational. It's not that historic transactional relationship that you've heard of between a grant maker and a grantee. At Bank of America, with all of our community relations managers and the representatives from the foundation, we really do rely on our foundation, our nonprofit grantees, to hear what's happening, for them to be transparent with us around what's working and not working, and to ask the questions. If you can't get an answer unless you ask the question. And asking questions, especially if you have that relationship, matters. And then last but not least, I think what's important for corporate funders in particular is the importance of people first. And I know Tanya had mentioned and Wendy had mentioned the importance of thinking about our employees and our employee safety. For us, as we were looking at how we were going to respond and how we will be allocating the $1 billion, our employees are top of mind. And so we're having courageous conversations with them. We're working with our employee resource groups. It is so critical that the representation we have within our organization is reflected in what we're talking about and what we're trying to do from an external standpoint too. And so my recommendation for the nonprofits on the line is, make sure that you support your contacts and your partners from within each of the funding organizations, and be willing to have these transparent conversations, because the only way we can move forward is together.
That's great. Thank you. One of the words that I used during my introduction was pivot, and I think pivot has become a new word of our day. Everybody is talking about how they pivoted during this time. We took some questions from registrants leading up to today, and many of their questions echoed the same questions that at Homeboy, we're asking ourselves on an ongoing basis in relations to our pivots, if you will. And really, the question is, as we think about how it is that we're being responsive and pivoting during this time, but we also think about our mission, right? And a core mission and identity that we've developed in Homeboy's case for over 30 years, right? How do we best reconcile our pivots and our mission in terms of our conversations with the foundation community during a time like this? I don't know that there's necessarily a right answer per se, but Wendy, I wonder if you can share just a little bit of insight in terms of what you've heard from your grantees and just how you're thinking about that question even within your own organization.
You know, I'm of two minds. You know, one is mission really matters, and that using that lens as the core lens for the organization. You know, otherwise you end up both chasing money, you know, that could be the tail that wags your dog, and not really what you intended to do at all. And I think that, you know, that tendency, you know, it's understandable. It's unwise. And even in this moment, I think organizations need to look at their mission. If their mission, you know, are they still committed to the mission? And if the answer is yes, then try to work toward that. Now, some organizations that are on the front lines of interacting with grantees suddenly are passing out food baskets, and that was not a normal part of what they did, but they were, you know, serving impoverished families. You can see how that fits into core mission. So I guess what I want to emphasize is mission really matters. And I would also recommend, there was a document, a 20-page sort of issue paper that came out from a group called Sea Change Partners in New York, SEA Change. And they talked about this moment and posited that there were three kinds of organizations: those that need to hibernate and really stop burning through their cash because there's really not that much they can accomplish during this period. Even performing arts organizations may be able to find some Zoom places to do work, but retreating, pulling in to live another day is actually one of the strategies. Those that are totally front lines, and then those that are a hybrid of the two. I think we're just trying to be realistic that organizations are going to be pushed and pulled, but we think the discipline of looking at everything through the lens of mission continues to matter.
Tanya, can you expand on that? It's wonderful. Thank you, Wendy.
Sure. So I think for Casey, just first looking inward, we're very blessed that our mission around strengthening children, families, and communities and creating the partnerships and innovating around system, it's almost like the moment in time is catching up with our mission. So it's not so much that we pivot to change our mission, and even many of our strategies were already in place that could stay in place in this moment in time. So it's not so much the what, it's more the how that's changed very much for us. And I think of it not so much as us pivoting as it is us leaning into the moment with our mission in mind, with the need in mind, and the result, trying to identify common results. So we would encourage our grantees to do something similar, because I would imagine that most of them already have a similar mission, or they probably wouldn't have been an Annie and Casey Foundation grantee. But how do they need to change their strategy in order to meet the mission that they had in mind, and maybe be more flexible, as we've been talking about, in the ways that they can invest and that we can invest in them to meet that result.
Great. Stephanie, you have anything on that question?
Yeah, if I could jump in. Look, pivot is something that we're not only thinking the nonprofit industry writ large will need to do, but as funders, we would need to do. So when I make these remarks, please know that it's not only self-reflective and introspective, but also about the industry. The truth of the matter is things aren't going back to normal. We know that nonprofits were already operating on a shoestring budget. Because of COVID, it's estimated that 40 upwards to 60% of nonprofits will not be able to survive one more year of operating. And so with the seriousness and gravity of what has resulted because of COVID, we really need to take a serious look in the mirror and think, well, how are we going to take action based on what we know who we are, right? So the pivot's not about identity, the pivot's around action. And my advice and the way I'm thinking about it from my portfolio is there are 3 R's. I like letters, so I can remember it. So there are 3 R's you could think about, right? The pivot's going to have to take place in terms of action, and in particular for nonprofits, how you fundraise. So the 3 R's you should keep in mind is how you take action to be responsive, how do you take action to recover from some of the impacts of COVID, especially if your businesses, your nonprofits had closed, and last but not least, how you reinvent, how you operate towards your mission and build that collaboration, that partnership that we spoke of. So responsiveness means, how are you really going to change the game on how you fundraise? You can't do dinners this year for sure, right? Unless it's virtual, right? How are you going to continue to fundraise in an environment that's mostly, if not completely virtual? You have to analyze short-term and long-term needs, and you have to really think about what the funder's looking for. Funders know that it's core operating and unrestricted, but that behooves the nonprofits to say, well, what is the funding priorities of those respective funders and philanthropy organizations, and how does it align with our overall mission? Because we're no longer thinking about specific programs and services. We're looking at your entire organization and your mission to see if it fits, if it's unrestricted core operating. And especially in corporate America, philanthropy is intricately connected with marketing and branding and how we treat our employees and our human resources now, right? Because we can't just say we're committed to addressing and being anti-racist. You have to see how we operate. And so knowing what corporations are trying to do, hopefully will help you think much more pragmatically about how you take action when it comes to being responsive. So funder connections and relationships. Recovery, from a pivot standpoint, has to do with how nonprofits are able to demonstrate their value, even though times are changing, and be open to different opportunities and different ways of measuring partnerships and success. I think for many of us, that barometer, right, that metric will be much broader than simply saying we've touched X many lives. Funders are now going to be asking, well, how diverse is your board? At what wage are you paying your employees, right? How are you operating from a diversity and inclusion mindset? Because we are now thinking about how we're trying to address race as it relates to our funding. And then last but not least, when it comes to reinvention, you can stay true to who you are as an organization, but don't be afraid to partner and collaborate. I think that coalition mindset around how a voice could be heard when we're better together is going to be so critical when it comes to reinventing. And again, you have to understand how you appeal, how you address the different needs of the various stakeholders that you work with, not just organizational philanthropy, but in particular individual philanthropy, because that should be the foundation for all of your fundraising, regardless of COVID or not.
Wondering, Wendy, go ahead, please.
I'd like to expand on that theme of collaboration, which I think is just key and has been. After the Great Recession in Los Angeles, we founded something called the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative. It was really based on the work of David LaPiana, who's written books about merger. And in our world, the nonprofit world has not celebrated mergers. We see them as failures on our side. And of course, the business world doesn't look at it that way. They're looking at impact and sustainability. And so we thought that the toolkit needed to be expanded when an organization is going through an inflection point. Let's say the founder is retiring after 25 years. That's a wonderful moment to consider the bigger picture and the idea of sustained collaboration with other nonprofits. What we have found, we provide through pooled funds. We have something like 25 funders in the pooled fund. We've made $4 million in grants to partners, to nonprofit partners who step up together to explore deep collaborations. Doesn't mean they're going to merge, and in fact, mergers are the smallest outcome. One of the most important outcomes has been some really very clever sort of umbrella organizations that have been found, and I'll use one for this group. There were a group of small arts nonprofits working with kids in probation camps in LA County. And they had access problems dealing with probation. You know, just getting onto the camps was challenging. And so they came together, 6 of them came together to explore collaborating. And what they ended up creating was an umbrella organization. They called it then the Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network. It grew to 15 nonprofits very quickly. None of them had to give up their identity, but they all became more competent at their core work and also in their outcome evaluations and all the things you'd like to see from our side, you know, as a funder. They established more capacity. And so we think this idea of deep collaboration, looking for partnerships, is going to be especially important in this era. And there's something called the Sustained Collaboration Network, because there are these groups of funders who have formed in the United States in various cities, New York, et cetera. And so I encourage nonprofits to Google that and look into it. Look into it while you still got money in the bank. You know, 2 failed organizations coming together is not a recipe for success. You know, while there's still some resources, this is a wonderful moment to explore how through partnership you can have more impact in your mission.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And it speaks to a question that we actually just saw come through from Mark Trudeau, who asked, you know, or said, one opportunity I see presented by the current moment is that of engaging entire social systems or systems to chart new paths forward together. Do your organizations have a need or tools for large group whole system engagement? To a certain degree, when
yes and no. Tanya could probably speak to that more than I can, because but I'd say in child welfare, we've been very focused for the last decade, the Parsons Foundation, on reimagining the child welfare system. And of course, we do that in partnership with the various KC entities nationally, and local relationship building. And, you know, we had a terrible death of a child that was, you know, created a focus for system change. But what we found in Los Angeles was that, and this may be true in most jurisdictions, is that the Child Welfare Department for us, Department of Children and Family Services, existed as a silo, not connected to mental health or public health or all the other resources that the county has to wrap around fragile families' lives. And so last year we helped support a retreat where the county human services directors, 7 of them, were treated like, you know, instead of being separate entities that don't relate to each other, it was the first time they had to be relationship oriented and to think, not being ordered to collaborate, but to think about on their own from the balcony what they might do differently. And what we're working on is a transformational plan to embed county workers in nonprofits, which are trusted in the community, to create community family resource centers. Part of the crisis we see right now is, you know, the courts have gone virtual, and there's actually an opportunity to provide more access to families if we think different, in collaboration with community-based organization and government. And I think that could really be radical systems change, because we can get, you know, staff at the front line at the street level, where, interacting where community, in community and not in big bureaucratic offices.
Tanya, I can say that I think of your work and think of you as a change agent and a systems change agent, absolutely, in what you do every day. And now we've layered in these times. Wondering if you can just share a little bit from your perspective on that question of broader systems change and the opportunity that this moment is affording us.
Sure. And I think Wendy was exactly right, that it's grounding whatever you're doing in community supports for children and families. I can give an example, and actually it grew out of a visit to an earlier Global Homeboy Network gathering where, as part of our systems change, we believe in influence. And we were able to bring some system players from some of the sites that we work on more hands-on, more intensively from Georgia to come and attend the Global Homeboy Network gathering, I think probably 4 years ago for the first time. And in that site visit contingent, there were judges, there was a police chief, there were folks from the school and some community partners. And they were influenced so much by the network of individuals, in addition to everything that they learned from the sessions on navigators and on the secure-based teams, that they were, and then in the social enterprises, that they were able to go back to Savannah, Georgia, and bring their partners from the community to the table and figure out, how do we want to serve our community members, children and families differently? And they created the Work Readiness Enrichment Program. And I'm going to shout out right now Veronica Vargas, because she's a former Homeboy employee who really was the inspiration behind this, and just gave so much of her heart and insight to helping them create this. And it was a partnership where at the time it was Goodwill Industries and some of the local arts organizations. And they put their resources in a pot. So one thing that Casey typically doesn't do is invest a whole lot into the programs themselves, because then when we leave, often the resources dry up. But we can invest in learning opportunities. And so being able to bring folks to learn from each other, and now we'll do more of this virtually, they can figure out what resources they have. And so they created this Work Readiness Enrichment Program, which allowed young people who were on probation, engaged in very serious offenses, to stay out of the custody of the state, to stay in their community, to do virtual learning and credit recovery, to get supported and loved on, and the resources they needed. And it taught the systems folks that they don't need to rely on the typical nail them, trail them, and jail them. Trail them, nail them, and jail them. You don't have to do that. You can really focus on, how do we help them create opportunity and connection? Another thing that they created was called, well, we had taken them on a site visit to learn about a multi-agency resource center, where folks who were struggling, instead of having to go to the courts to get connected, were able to go to a center and find services. Well, they reached out to I think the DA's office, they reached out to the city, they reached out to the county. The city provided the building. The county paid for repairs on the building. The DA offered someone to manage the building, and then community organizations came to the table and staffed. And then they asked the young people, what should we name it? And one of the young people from the Work Readiness Enrichment Program said, we should name it the Front Porch, because the front porch is where you can go and sit and have someone listen to your problems. And so they named it the Front Porch. They had a young person come up with the graphic art, and it exists today as a commingling of funds and resources and people. as a way to keep young people out of the system. And so this is an example of how influence, opportunity, people innovating around a moment in time can help people lean in and create something for the future. Because that, to me, is an example of where we all need to go. And then once we did that, some of our grantees from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, they now want to go to Savannah. They want to come to the Global Homeboy Network. They want to see what's happening so that they can share the influence even broader. And so that's the beauty of the moment and the beauty of gatherings like this and the beauty of sharing and problem solving around how to make things better for kids and family rather than just continuing the typical system responses that we have.
That's great. And, you know, all of your comments, did you have something to add, Stephanie?
Yeah, I did. Like, I love the examples that Wendy and Tanya had provided. I will say that as a funder, we are in it for systems change. We want to build back better, and we're not looking to use our philanthropy or our grants as Band-Aids. But I will say that that comes in different forms. And for corporations like ours, our philanthropy alone will not change systems. But as a company, as an entire organization, we do believe we could play a game-changing role. And so when it comes to how we play a pivotal role in changing systems, we really look at it from a 360 approach. Philanthropy is at the table as it should be. You have to invest dollars where you want to take action, where you're saying you want to make a difference. But you also need to think about it from the perspective as a company, right? How are our products and services really reflecting this commitment? Are we using our public policy arm to make a statement and use our voice in legislation and in policy? Are we using our capital? Are we investing in the communities, not just through philanthropy, but because it's good business sense? And most importantly, how are our employees being deployed and mobilized to be that voice and be change agents on the ground because of what we believe in? So yes, we do believe in systems change, but it's not going to be completely philanthropy. That's
great. Your comments, all of your comments are inspiring lots of questions. My cell phone is blowing up because I'm getting lots of questions from folks. And there seem to be a couple of themes that are emerging right now based on what it is that you've said that maybe we can quickly address. One of them would be this notion of investment that I think you've all mentioned. Wendy, you mentioned the plight of the nonprofit organization and how difficult that investment question is. And I think from some of the questions that I'm seeing coming our way from a grant making perspective is, as this time continues to move on, how will institutional donors be more receptive to, or at least there's maybe a perception that institutional donors haven't been as receptive to indirect or overhead or somehow what might be considered to be investment in staff, for lack of a better term, right? That is really important. So how is this time sort of changing that? If it is, maybe that's never been the case, and that perception is not right. And then secondly, collaboration obviously is sort of emerged here as a theme. And I know this certainly as someone who is hoping to further collaboration at Homeboy and has done collaborations in the past. Collaboration is hard, right? It's not a no-brainer, right? There's a lot of heavy lifting, frankly, that goes into putting together successful collaborations. So I'm wondering, maybe Wendy, starting with you, if you can speak a little bit back to this point on investment and the way that maybe Parsons and what you're seeing from the foundation community is really thinking about in terms of how we as fundraisers should be asking that question right now on the front of investment. And then secondly, maybe you can just cite a little bit more of what you would say do's and don'ts or successes and failures in the spirit, in the realm of collaboration, because it's a hard thing.
I'd love to take a minute to address that. Relationships are hard. Whether they're, your loved ones or the office or, anywhere, life is really about trust and relationships. And so taking the time to develop them really matters. So I would start there, as an issue on the work that we've done around collaboration. We have found that, I also would share there's this proverb, the African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It will take longer to collaborate. It's hard to organize, everybody's, get their noses pointed in the same direction, right? Just that can be a big success. So you got to invest the time and recognize that it will take time. And you've got to have, like, your spidey sense, your emotional intelligence needs to be attuned to do the collaborative work. But in what we've done in the sustainability initiative, we provide a consultant who's almost sometimes like a therapist. It's a neutral party to help sort of untangle the work so that people can find a way forward. So that consulting expertise, I think, can really help as people, work on collaborating.
Planning grants, Wendy, on that front. I mean, how are you sort of seeing the role of planning grants right now?
I think that's another strategy. That's another way forward. There is just barriers to collaborating that are human. And so the willingness to think it through. We saw a couple of large community FQHCs, federally qualified health centers, serving hundreds of thousands of patients, come together around their IT. They didn't merge, but again, they were able to develop a much more sophisticated third-party billing. The world of health centers has completely changed since Affordable Care Act, and it can be technical fixes can happen. So I think this exploration is really important. I also think this theme of nothing about us without us. We are so, smart and top down, and, we'll figure it out for everybody. And the answer is no. You really need to make sure that lived experience is part of the work and part of the collaborating. So I hope that was responsive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Tanya, can you weigh in on maybe collaborations from your perspective and what you mentioned one, but maybe some tips for folks who are hoping to create collaborations and guidance around that front from your experience and what you've seen?
Sure. Well, first, I just wanted to address the point of there's a question about the indirect and the overhead administrative costs. And so one thing that Casey has done since we're in this new pandemic moment is make sure that the grantees have an option to have a higher percentage of their grant can go towards administrative costs. So the scope of work is a little more balanced, recognizing that they're going to need a lot more flexibility just to keep the lights on and keep the technology in place. As it relates to collaboration, we do something similar in terms of our strategic consulting model. It is often helpful to have sort of a neutral party that is able to have those behind the scenes conversations, but you still need someone in the lead who is trusted and respected to call people to the table. In Savannah, it was the chief judge of the juvenile court. In other jurisdictions, it may be someone else, but you need someone who's respected and trusted, whether it's from the community or the system, who calls people to the table and who, when that person calls, they will come. And then we encourage people to really grapple with what are your specific goals. Don't pick too many. Pick a couple of manageable goals or SMART goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Pick 2 to 3 SMART goals that everyone can get behind, and then talk about the roles and responsibilities. What are people going to bring to the table? What results and how are you going to measure the results and demonstrate that this time is effective? No one likes to come and collaborate and just talk. As much as we are, particularly now, all on video conferences, just video conferences that aren't designed with a results purpose can give people fatigue. Like, I know people have video conference fatigue right now. So if you're going to do it by video conference, make sure, even more so, that you're designed with a particular agenda that's focused on goals that everyone can resonate with. And then how frequently do you need to meet and come back with a plan forward, a roadmap forward to get to those results. So I think collaboration is hugely important. It's particularly important in order to sustain whatever the innovations are. But I'll say that right now, because we're in a time of uncertainty, we all should be making room for people to innovate and fail and reconfigure and try it again. So that's one thing that I know I'm personally trying to figure out how to build into the work that I do. And I know Casey more broadly is having that conversation as well, because this should be a time of innovation, and we don't want people to feel as if they don't get it right, that's it. That is part of the learning process, just as anyone who is going into their change process. Sometimes you stumble, sometimes you make a wrong calculation, and that has to be a part of the collaborative effort as well.
You know, I'd like to speak to that issue of overhead. It is very difficult as a grantee to change a funder's assumptions. If a funder only wants to buy you equipment, and they like to buy real things like, you know, fire trucks and cars, because they can kick the tires, they might change over time. And I think the way they change is by being part of a grant-making community, by hearing from other funders. It's unfortunate that just hearing from you won't do the job, because I don't think it will. I don't think that an individual grantee can fix a funder's focus. But over time, you know, I've been at the Parsons Foundation since forever, 1986. So I'm old, and I have the arc of time to look at how change happens. And I think it happens that we influence each other. And I will say that in California, there's been a real drumbeat around the overhead question. And federally, there is regulations that you can get a minimum of 10%. And we're trying to work all of the governmental entities, jurisdictions, to at a minimum recognize that 10% floor on overhead. Obviously, general support is an easier answer. And I think as we share our enthusiasm for unrestricted support and how it's mattered, it has a momentum. And while 20 years ago it was almost unheard of, today I wouldn't call it a trend, but it exists as a part of institutional philanthropy. So I think there's progress. I think that, on the overhead issue, the Real Cost Project, if people Google that, there's been effort made to try to get all jurisdictions, both philanthropy and government, to step up to overhead. But because we know that overhead is how you deliver quality. That's where the capacity part is. And so it's not extra and unnecessary. It's like the core of the work is the overhead, actually.
Mm-hmm. Can I add something to this? When it comes to knowing what you need as an organization and looking for the funders who are able and willing to provide it, to Wendy and Tanya's point, it is relational, but it is also built on trust. And you have the power and the right to say, this is not the funding I need, especially when it comes to government contracts, right? If this is not the funding you're looking for, don't feel the pressure to take it. It's called voting with your wallet. And Edelman actually put out a great study on the trust barometer. They recently did an updated survey in terms of, given COVID and the dual pandemic of racial inequality, how is trust being built within organizations? And this is applicable for funders and nonprofits alike. And so just know that you can vote with your wallet, you can vote with who you partner with, And you should absolutely be wary of what they call woke washing, right? Which is, are you working with organizations? Are you accepting money from funders who are truly in it for the long run? And I think it takes 3 specific pillars to make this assessment. And again, I can't take credit. This is all from the Edelman study. First is, how do you take action? And I went through the 3 R's around response, recovery, and reinvention, right? The second one that I think is critical and we haven't really touched is communication. Like, how are you mobilizing your organization and all of your stakeholders to communicate about what your needs are, to listen to funders, and to have that 2-way dialogue? And it shouldn't just be your fund development person. It shouldn't just be the CEO. Now's the time to mobilize everyone within your organization to be able to do this listening tour and listening session. Some of the best practices include mobilizing your board to help reconnect with donors and to listen and to see where your organization still aligns with their priorities. Because at the end of the day, if they're not thinking that your whole organization and trusting that your whole organization is going to make a difference, and you're looking for overhead and core unrestricted operating support, you have to think about whether or not that's the relationship you want to be in, right? And last but not least is empowerment. I know everyone wants to go after organizational thing and philanthropy, but the truth of the matter is, as well, organizational philanthropy has seen a decline, again, from the survey. Individual consumer purchases that are motivated by purpose, individual high net worth donors have actually increased their giving by 30% because of the pandemic. And so you really need to think about how you're empowering your operations, your fund development, to really take advantage of some of the opportunities that are now beholden to us because of this new reality. Are you thinking about the virtual platform? Are you thinking about socially related purchasing and purchase related opportunities that will benefit your organization? So I just had to put it out there because I know we're thinking overhead. I know we're thinking collaboration. We hear all these terms around pivoting, but you really got to get down to what will build trust. And I love, Wendy, what you had said, and Tanya, what you had said around trust and partnership being critical to answering this question.
Yeah, and I would just extend on that, none of our lives are perfect. And right now, if you probe very much into anybody's life, there's stuff going on. We're all experiencing a lot of stress. And so I think that sometimes people want to say, my life is perfect. I've got a picket fence. My kids are perfect. Everything is perfect. And we know that's not true. We know this is a time of a lot of difficulty. And so I encourage people to say, well, we had a plan and then things happened, and share what happened. Because we live real lives too. And we don't, I think get rid of the perfection problem. You're just not going to be perfect. Nobody's going to be perfect. You're going to have to be good enough. And then I think being willing to be trained, it feels risky to share your problems, but I actually think that's how you develop trust. So it's counterintuitive. It's asking you to reveal your rough parts, the things you're not proud of maybe, or that you're struggling with. And I think in doing that, that's how you develop the relationship. Oh, Steve, you're still muted.
Absolutely.
It's become part of our vocabulary during this time. You're on mute. Apologize for I wanted to stick on the partnership piece just for a little bit before we move on, as we're starting to run out of time a bit. But I'm personally curious to hear from any of you on the notion of public-private partnerships and what you're seeing in that space right now. Certainly, we continue to look to government partners at Homeboy for much needed funding, and obviously there are constraints there and pressures that government funders are facing like they've never faced before. But I'm wondering how, if you can all weigh in, or some of you weigh in just for a bit, on what you're seeing sort of down the road on the government funding front, and how partnerships maybe on that front might emerge as being a way to access more funding because of these partnerships might actually exist.
Yeah, I would just say I think it's critical. The reality is, you know, if we look at the bubble of the economy and you look at philanthropy's dollars, you know, we are budget dust. The real money in helping families is really federal money that comes through counties. It is, you know, and figuring out how to align that with community-based organizations is, I think, where the magic is going to be. You know, I think government has worked very much in isolation from community. And I think that there's a drumbeat of engagement that's occurring, of, you know, including co-locations. You know, government has people. They may not have money to make grants to nonprofits. You know, that we're in such a panicky state about resources right now. So it might not be that the money is there, but they have staff. And that's a different kind of resource. And if there's a way to work more collaboratively, in Los Angeles, we've done something interesting. We created a center for strategic partnership. Philanthropy stepped up with money, and the county agreed to partner. And over a 3-year period, we piloted a center for strategic partnership in deep collaboration with the county and hand in hand in philanthropy. And at the end of that period, that office was made a permanent part of county government. And it's not really there to raise money. It's, you know, it's not there to go after money on behalf of the county. It's there to work on collaborations. So I think that model is really important, and is, you know, is a leadership model that could be emulated, because it is relationship bound. I was talking about making sure that the different people in government know each other and can work collaboratively. Having them have a relationship and then having that expand to we're in trust together opens doors for collaboration that could be really powerful. You know, we have 35,000 children in the Los Angeles County who are touched by the child welfare system. There are 9,000 people who work for the Department of Children and Family Services. You know, these are systems with real scale. And if we can connect them in trusting relationships with community-based organizations, we think we could make a world of difference in families' lives, particularly if we're listening closely to the lived experience.
Tanya, you referenced public-private a little bit in your earlier remarks. I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit more of maybe the crystal ball from your perspective in terms of how you're seeing that continue to develop.
Yes, so it's hugely important, and it's going to be even more important moving forward, particularly as the state budgets start to be very stressed in this pandemic. I'm hearing a lot of stress on the state systems. Hopefully there will continue to be federal funding that is available, but the commingling and the partnering of the public entities, child serving systems, and folks in the community, and even bringing in more private investor collaborations and funding. So it could be foundations, it could be smaller investment. There are often individual family investors who are interested in investing in socially responsible activities and innovations. And so now is the time to start building relationships or extending those relationships and having those conversations. I know I'm in lots of conversations right now. The work I do is really heavy on providing technical assistance to sites. So I mentioned Georgia. I'm also doing a lot of work with my team in New Jersey. Several of them have been able to come to this gathering in person, both in 2019 and 2018. But they are figuring out how to do RFPs for what they need to serve the children in their custody and care right now. And even if it's not a lot of money, it's something that can make a difference. And if there is private money to bring to the table, that makes that pot and that strategy go a whole lot further. So I do think that sustainability is going to require partnerships. As I said previously, it's how that's going to require a lot more thought to figure it out in this time of virtual connection. But I really think it can be done, and the more we build the confidence in each other, I think we will innovate around this in a different way.
That's great. Stephanie, you have anything to add on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I totally agree with Tanya and Wendy. I think the loudest criticism of professional philanthropy is that power is not being shared. And I think that question around public-private partnerships gets to the self-realization that philanthropy alone can't make that game-changing difference. So we have to work across sectors. We have to partner with and not just fund nonprofit grantees to really address some of the issues that we say we really care about. And so to be able to give some of that inherent power, or let go of that inherent power and share it with those with lived experience, with other sectors that could really create that game-changing difference, and build efficiencies, most importantly, is absolutely critical. But it starts with being humble, with the self-realization that foundations could look to partner, corporations should look to partner, governments should look at innovative ways of addressing some of the most pressing social issues. And an example that I wanted to share are social impact bonds. And so now there are opportunities. Not every nonprofit is ready to be that recipient or that intermediary, but we're looking at innovations where philanthropy coupled with the private sector and government institutions can make a difference in how systems are being done. And in New York in particular, Bank of America partnered with New York State and social finance, and the nonprofit was the Center for Employment Opportunities, to see if the way CEO helped returning citizens find immediate employment change the tide in recidivism versus what's currently taking place with New York State and some of the individuals who are being able to go back into society. And so Bank of America was not only an investor, but we were able to make that as a public offering to some of our individual clients who, again, are motivated to give from a social conscious perspective. So yes, cross-sector collaboration is absolutely important and innovations are taking place, but it really does take the funder to think about how we're going to be able to share some of the inherent power that's rooted in philanthropy.
That's great, thank you. Before we move to our last sort of section on context and climate, taking a number of questions, a little bit of a pivot here to issues of economic development, workforce development. We have a number of organizations as a part of the Global Homeboy Network, as you know, who are heavily invested or considering investing in social enterprises to mobilize on that front, and also at the same time create sustainable revenues for their own organizations. But generally, there have been a number of questions that have come my way on pitfalls, your thoughts on organizations at this point in time who are considering investing more heavily in social enterprise models, and how you're thinking about those organizations from a funding perspective. And then also how you're thinking about your own organizations in terms of workforce development, employment opportunities. Wendy, you mentioned not a lot of turnover, but your organization earlier, but how you're thinking about your own organizations at this time in terms of their roles on the front of workforce development and employment for folks. So some themes in there. I'm wondering, Wendy, if you want to just start quickly with any notions on the social enterprise and workforce development front and how you're sort of seeing that right now.
Well, just on the social enterprise front, businesses fail, and social enterprise businesses fail too. And they often fail because they're undercapitalized. Mm-hmm. And, you know, wishful thinking about what, you know, if everything works right, we can do it on this, you know, of course, everything won't work right. And so, you know, I guess I would just say the planning and execution really matters. You know, we have seen, you know, simple things like a thrift shop fail. because they're not so simple as it turns out. Or, developing, cleanup, graffiti paint out projects, or, there's to the more sophisticated, build a bakery. Homeboy has its own story of how hard it's been to, kind of get to the edge of your resources, not want to lay people off because, it's a tragedy for them. So I think, I guess the messaging is really research carefully and have more money available than you think it's going to take.
Well said. Anything to add, Tanya or Stephanie?
Yeah, I'll go. Wendy's absolutely right. When it comes to going into business ventures like social enterprises, you really need to think about that hurdle around startup costs. Most nonprofits actually do make a significant amount of their unrestricted dollars from fee-for-service. So it's not necessarily new. But if you're going through the social enterprise process, you really need to think through the sustainability model, right? How is that going to really help with reliable recurring revenues? And is it going to give your organization the opportunity to, again, using that word, to pivot, but really be nimble should current environments change? And quite frankly, it's very fluid. We were talking earlier, Wendy, Tanya, and I, about how fluid current events are and how we have to stay nimble, not only as funders, but as a nonprofit industry and community around what the most pressing needs are around this dual pandemic. And so I do think there is opportunity with maximizing what your offering is from a consumer social-minded purchase mindset. But you really need to be honest with yourselves around the operating budgets that you have in place and the sustainable revenues.
That's great.
And I would just add that you want to be realistic. You want to be pragmatic. Now may not be the time to do a social enterprise that requires in-person connection, but there's some need to innovate around doing things that people will pay for, that people can pay for, that doesn't involve a lot of face-to-face. So I think there's some innovation opportunity there. And then who are you serving, and who are you employing, and what are their needs? Because if it's not someone who's actually ready to work, then you need to invest in supporting their training and development and whatever social services needs they might have. And you got to factor in, as Homeboys does, I know, for the idea that there might be a relapse moment. And so you have to cover make sure all your bases are covered so that the business can be sustainable, but also build in the support services as well.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts there. And I would encourage everyone who's tuning in today to tune into the next plenary session that we have, which is going to be on social enterprises. And there'll be a number of stories there about the challenges of this time that each of you referenced, and also a little bit of the pivot piece that has come into play for many of the organizations who are running social enterprises. But our time is running short, and I just wanted to move to sort of a final piece of context and climate that each of you has touched on, certainly. But, as we sort of, for lack of a better term, settled into this new normal of the pandemic, what has come along has been a murder, George Floyd's murder, and a new public momentum rooted in Black Lives Matter and social justice initiatives. And that has certainly been a new impetus for every organization to examine themselves, the representation of African American and Black voices at all levels, and their commitment to being anti-racist. So I'm wondering if each of you just might take a few minutes to share how the foundation community is playing a role in that front, obviously a leading role in that front. Your organizations, again, you've spoken to this issue quite a bit during our call. And then how grant makers should be thinking about integrating more of that content and work and focus into its narratives or their narratives as they have conversations with you and build partnerships on that front. So lots to unpack there. But Wendy, I'll start.
Well, you've asked the hardest question at the end, which in a way we can be grateful for. You know, I think we have to start first with our own organizations. Let's first start by reflecting on our own behaviors, values, the way we execute the work. What can we do differently in a space we control? Not that I control who's on my board, but I get to influence it. And so I look at my own board's diversity, which I'm very proud of. That happened over time. It didn't happen overnight. And so we have the fierce urgency of now, but you also have reality that's people in place. So you have to, every time you have a vacancy, you have to take it really seriously and work much harder at diversity without, from my point of view, never sacrificing excellence. Those really sparkling diverse candidates are in high demand, either for your board or your staff. And sometimes you get close to a candidate and can't secure them. I mean, I've watched it happen on boards. It's very hard to get the sparkling people, but yet we can't give up. So I think first start at home. Then, look at your own staff. What have you done there? Again, I think of it as over time. In California, we have labor laws that are really, you can't let people go just because you want a more diverse staff. So you've got to be, this is a time for a lot of HR risk. So there's that issue. And then there's keeping, this is something we resisted doing, but we're going to begin doing it. We spend a lot on capacity building for our nonprofits. We've sent 100 people to Stanford's nonprofit training program in cohorts. We've done a lot of creative things, but I think one of the things that we really need to do is look at our own behaviors. So we have never tracked the race or ethnicity of the CEOs of the nonprofits that we serve. And we've decided we need to do that. It's kind of a momentous internal decision, to be honest. But we decided if we don't have a quick way to grab that as they define it, not as we define it, first of all, you got to ask people. You can't just make an assumption. It's a way that we can invest more in African-American led and serving organizations if we have done the work internally to track it.
Thank you, Tanya.
So just quickly, because it looks like we're maybe almost out of time, we're enhancing our focus on race, equity, and inclusion. We're very focused on youth and young adults. We're looking into perhaps funding something around organizing. And we do collect data on workforce composition to make sure that where we're investing, they are also paying attention to equity and inclusion.
Yeah, and just to build off of what Tanya and Wendy said, the current events have caused a sense of urgency and a recognition that we as a company and as an organization need to do more. And while we've invested in social justice and second chance for many years now, we realize that we need to be able to stand at the ready when we need to do more at a quicker pace. And our CEOs championing to say, okay, I love what you guys are doing, but we need to do more and we need to do more now, is really that urgency that I think is calling our action to not only be external and how we give grants and invest in communities, but how we look internally as well. And we're taking a really deep look. Like, who are the vendors we work with? Do they represent the diversity that we need to see in businesses? How are our employees looking? And more importantly, how does our leadership look? And our employees have been that proximity of experience that we really need to hear from. And we're having courageous conversations where we're encouraged to speak up and talk about what we're experiencing, what we'd like and don't like about what the company is doing or what the company could do more of. And our leaders are listening. And so I love that about the current event, and it makes me hopeful.
Thank you, Stephanie. And we're a little bit over. So I want to say a big thanks, Wendy, Tanya, Stephanie, for you taking this time, sharing your remarkable insights with us all. And, I started with the question of, what's firing you up? And I know that this Global Homeboy Network convening and everyone who was in attendance today, hearing you has set off a new set of inspirations amongst us, including with me. So thank you so much for sharing and being a part of this. And we'll look forward to having you back in future convenings. And take good care, be well, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And we're so proud of your work. It's a privilege to help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good seeing you all.
Bye.